ask you, kind of unrelated subject of the review, on the effects of the changes in the law regarding the offence of prostitution, and specifically the effects of this change on vulnerable women. The number of women that have been charged with the offence of brothel keeping since the change to the legislation, and will you please make a statement on the matter?
Thank you, Cathaoirleach, and thank you to the Deputy for raising again this important question. The principal aim of the changes made by Part 4 of the Criminal Law Sexual Offences Act was to provide additional protection to those involved in prostitution, especially for those who are particularly vulnerable and, as I've just outlined, those who are victims of human trafficking. Among the changes made was to remove those who offer their services as a prostitute from the existing offences of solicitation or soliciting. This allows people working in prostitution to provide information to the Gardaí on, for example, violence towards them by clients, and this also means they can do so without risking prosecution for selling sexual services themselves. The Act also introduced 2 new offences, and again I outlined them previously: paying for sexual activity with a prostitute, paying for sexual activity with a trafficked person, and it increases the existing penalty for brothel keeping. In relation to a review of the effects of the 2017 Act, the Act itself provides for a review 3 years after its commencement. As such, in July I commissioned the independent expert, Ms Maura Butler, to undertake the review, and I know Deputy Connolly asked for a timeline. I don't have a timeline, but I know that she is working on it and will have it concluded as soon as possible. The review will look at whether or not the changes made are in practice operating as intended. Are they offered additional protection to those who are most vulnerable? It will assess the impact of Part 4 on the safety, the well-being of persons engaged in sexual activity for payment, and it will consider if further measures are needed to strengthen these protections. In addition, it will quantify the number of arrests and convictions in respect of offences under Part 4. The review is already underway, as I've said, and an online public consultation was open up until mid-September, which is, I think, very welcome in regards to the review. I understand the contributions were received from a broad range of organisations with, of course, very different perspectives. In relation to the second part of the Deputy's question, I am informed by An Garda Síochána that since the commencement of the relevant legislation provisions on the 27th of March 2017, there have been 60 reported incidents of brothel keeping up until the 15th of October of this year. I understand that of the 37 suspects associated with these incidents, 31 were female, 6 were male. To date, 20 have been charged or summoned in relation to these offences, again 17 of whom are female and 3 are male. I want to assure the Deputy that the work of my department in this area will continue to be guided by our primary aim of protecting the safety and the well-being of the most vulnerable women here.
Minister. Deputy Smith.
Yeah, I'm afraid, as usual, the questions aren't answered, and like Deputy Connolly, I think without giving us a date for the completion of the review, it's not satisfactory. If the law states it has to be conducted within 3 years, then we should have a date for it. I was recently involved in a debate in a students' union in UCD, where it was said by people who support the opposite position, who actually pushed for this legislation, and who don't support the Sex Workers Alliance of Ireland, who actually kind of organise to undermine them in many ways, and they are opposed to this review being completed. So this prompted my question: why do we not have a date for the review being completed? Are there outside pressures on you? Are there sort of groups pushing to say don't do this review, because I know that is their wish? I also am alarmed to see that there's 20 people charged with brothel keeping. I put in a PQ not a couple of months ago to ask how many purchases of sex were being charged, and I got an answer back to say that there were several files with the DPP. There's no actual charges against the purchases of sex at that time. Now, perhaps you have figures on that, because I think what this reveals is that perhaps this change in legislation isn't working in favour of those for whom it's meant to protect.
Thank you, Deputy. In relation to the review, my understanding is that the review was to start 3 years after the legislation, so that was to start it's initially in March, but with the election, with the formation of government and with COVID, there was a slight delay. Also, the fact that Maura Butler, who is taking on the review, has also undertaken a review on familicide. There are 2 pieces of work happening concurrently, but I have spoken to Maura this week, and while I don't have an exact timeline, I will be meeting with her again later on, probably in the next 2 or 3 weeks, to get into more detail and to see if there is any additional support that she herself and her team needs. So while it was a little bit late starting, and I hope the Deputy can understand why with COVID and the formation of the government, and also the other review she's undertaken, she is absolutely committed to this work, and when I do have a timeline, I'll make that available. Deputy Connolly asked whether this would be made public. Yes, this will be made public. In relation to whether or not anybody has been asking for us not to do it, that's absolutely not the case, and I've not had anybody request that this review not happen or be delayed. In relation to the figures that the Deputy asks of, I don't have them offhand, but I will try and get further information for you on that. I mean, the review itself, what we're trying to understand is whether or not it's working, whether or not there are an increased incidence of women coming forward where there have been violence against them, where they feel unsafe, but where they have been trafficked, most importantly, that they know it's safe to do so and to come forward. And I do hope that that's what that review will very much highlight to us. Thank you.
Deputy Smith.
I'm sure you're aware, because you are the Minister for Justice, that being charged with keeping a brothel may mean that you're two women or two people in the same space. And the personal evidence of many sex workers is that they stay in the same space in twos for their safety, and particularly during COVID, there's evidence there that their safety was much more compromised during COVID. So I'm quite alarmed to hear that there's been 20 charges of brothel keeping, and it would be good if we could get a breakdown of what that meant. Was it 2 women? Was it 20? Was it 5? Or was it indeed somebody pimping them and in charge of their work? Because I think you'll find that by and large it is 2 people together, working together for their own safety, or working in the same space for their own safety. So I think there's a lot of questions to be asked, and I would just repeat that it's important that we get the information on when the review will be complete, when we can have it. It's important to that cohort of very vulnerable people who are being charged for protecting themselves and keeping themselves safe. And also the other question I asked was, could we get a number of those who've been charged with the purchase of sex, so we can have a look at the figures and see what's happening.
Minister McEntee.
Thank you, Deputy. Again, I'll undertake to get those figures for you. As I've said in the initial response to date, of the 20 people who have been charged, 17 of those are female and 3 are male. And I have to admit, I asked the same question. Why are so many of those, of the 60 incidents, 37 then associated with these 31 were female? Is there a situation where many of these women are doing so under coercion or under pressure and don't necessarily want to be there themselves? And I think if you look at the fact that of the 60, there are only 17 who have been charged, the Gardaí will at every instance try to engage with whether it's somebody suspected of keeping a brothel, but to engage with them to understand their situation, to try and understand whether this is something that they themselves are happy to do, or whether it's something that they have been put under pressure. So there is every, I suppose there is at every stage an opportunity for the Gardaí to try and engage with these women and to try and ascertain as to whether or not they're there of their own volition or not. In relation to those who work together, and I know this is a question that came up when the legislation was being passed, there are concerns that if you decriminalise brothel keeping, that it could create a loophole, that it could even furthermore allow abuse by criminal gangs and others who wish to profit from prostitution. But this is something that's been reviewed in the legislation, and as I've said, I'm very confident that Maura Butler is carrying out that work and that we will have that review as soon as possible. Thank you.
We're moving on to question number 10. Deputy Bríd Smith, you have 30 seconds to introduce the question.